So I'm going to talk about policy issues because the Global Warming Policy Foundation is called Policy Foundation because this is our main focus. I will be talking about three issues today. A crisis in terms of the economic costs. We already heard about the costs of climate change, and I will be talking about the cost of climate policy. The problem is beginning to trickle down internationally. All over Europe, governments are beginning to talk about the costs. People are becoming concerned about the costs. I will also talk about the implications for European industries as a result of rising costs. Then I will talk briefly about the technological problems with the policies, in particular with renewable energy, and finally the political costs and the political climate change in Europe. So what kind of crisis am I talking about? So I will show that the policies being adopted, have been adopted for about 20 years, have had a significant impact on energy prices, which has reduced competitiveness of European industries. I will also talk about the failure of the renewables to solve the technological problem of intermittency and what consequences that has. And finally, I will be talking about the division, growing division between Eastern, Western European countries on the policies and the implications and the rise of discontent, public discontent, and with it the rise of populist parties, many of which are critical of the consensus, the European green energy consensus. So, just as a starter, the green consensus in Europe emerged roughly about 30 years ago or so. There we go. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of green parties, which were the first to push the green energy agenda and the decarbonization agenda. And at the beginning, the assumption was that global warming is an urgent matter. Nothing, we heard that, climate change is a problem, but not an urgent one and not an immediate one. But at the time, the assumption was that the doubling of CO2 would lead to a rise of roughly 3 degrees warming. That was the assumption. It was regarded as an urgent matter that needed urgent policy. The second assumption at the time was that we're running out of conventional fossil fuel-based fuels, oil and gas, and that as a result, energy price would go up and renewable energy would become competitive. And thirdly, that there would be an international agreement on climate change, that there would be a level playing field with legally binding targets so that the global community would come together to tackle climate change. And of course, at the time, slightly later, the so-called Lisbon agenda, this wasn't an assumption, this was a goal to make Europe the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. This was the Lisbon agenda to transform the EU into the most competitive, dynamic, knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion. And in contrast, you had basically two what I would call contrasting policies, but at the time it was regarded that this would actually deliver that, the green agenda. So let's briefly talk about the failure of these assumptions. So instead of an accelerated, rapid warming, what we've seen over the last 30, 40 years is actually a much more moderate warming than most models predicted. So instead of a warming trend of 0.3 degree per decade, we have seen something much, much smaller, half of which roughly. So in other words, the warming is much slower, more gradual than 30 years ago most modelers were telling governments. The shale revolution is producing abundant, unconventional oil and gas. We're swimming in cheap energy instead of running out of energy. There is no international agreement with legally binding targets. The Paris Agreement is just kind of agreement that is voluntary and based on individual countries to set kind of ideas where they want to go in the future, but nothing that was initially thought to be a Kyoto Type 2 with legally binding targets. And instead of becoming the most competitive economy, the EU is stagnating economically, particularly compared to the rest of the world. It's not doing very well and is losing international competitiveness. Europe is, compared to the rest of the world, declining in its role, in its position. Of course, you could argue it's excellent that the rest of the world is picking up, that particularly the developing world is doing, much of the developing world is doing much better economically. The economic growth in much of the developing world is much better than in Europe. That would be fine if Europe weren't doing so poorly. So I'm not claiming that this is a direct result of the green energy policies, but we'll come to that. And here you can see the projections that Europe will no longer be in the first world in 2050. It will be kind of second-rate part of the world if it continues in its current economic policies. So these are the kind of projections. So Europe has a big challenge. In addition to the failure that I mentioned, Europe is also struggling with its actual decarbonization policies. So the low-hanging fruit, the easy bits, the closing of old factories, of dirty industries, of coal-fired power plants, all of the easy bit has been done. And we've seen what happens in a country like France, where you already have an electricity system that is almost entirely decarbonized. When you then start to try to cut CO2 more, you have to actually target drivers, transport, and you can see that isn't very popular. None of the EU countries apparently is actually decarbonizing fast enough or radically enough to achieve the ambitious targets that they have set themselves as part of the Paris Agreement. So most countries are currently lagging behind in achieving targets for 2020, and none is really performing sufficiently to reduce targets radically, CO2 radically for 2030. So there's a problem, and I'll come to the problem. And when you look at the renewables, here's a big question. If renewables are so cheap and so competitive as we are told, how come that investment in Europe is declining fast? And of course, one of the key reasons why investment in Europe is declining fast and spreading in many other parts of the world is that in Europe, governments have begun to cut subsidies left, right, and center. And believe it or not, once you cut subsidies, hardly anyone is building a wind farm. Because no wind farm, unless you have a company like Amazon paying a kind of premium to a wind farm to take some of that energy. But without government subsidies and without big companies offering very lucrative deals, no one is building a wind farm because it simply doesn't make any economic sense. So why are governments cutting subsidies? Well, governments are cutting subsidies because they have made energy more expensive through energy bills are becoming a problem both for industry and for households. So, and you see this all over Europe. There are a few countries where they are still expanding, where there are still subsidies available, but they are expanding at a much, much slower rate than 5 or 10 years ago. And in Europe, you have a situation where half of Europe is not building a single wind turbine. That was last year. Now, so we have mentioned the economic issues, and now I want to briefly mention the technological problems based on a new paper by a couple of German researchers who looked into the problem of intermittency. And when renewable energy was promoted 20, 30 years ago, the assumption was 15 minutes. The assumption was that, I'll make it 10. The assumption was that, okay, when the wind doesn't blow in Germany, there will be other parts of Europe where the wind will blow, and so Germany will simply import wind energy or electricity generated by wind from other parts of Europe. And that would solve the problem of intermittency. So these researchers now did the following. They looked at first the German situation, and then they looked at the European situation in terms of wind generated electricity. So first of all, and the other, of course, assumption was that if you have tens of thousands of wind turbines, and I think Germany has now 40,000, something like that, so 56,000 megawatts today, that if you build them, so many, eventually some will always blow. Now, what they show is that despite a increase of, a 12-fold increase in the last 18 years, as you can see, this is the capacity, this is the maximum, this is the mean, and this is the minimum. And what you see here is that despite the 12-fold increase in capacity, the minimum production has remained more or less the same. So despite the fact that you've increased wind capacity 12-fold, you still have a few days per year where there is hardly any electricity generated by these 40,000 wind turbines. Now, as I said, what these researchers wanted to show or find out is how do you solve this problem? Because a powerhouse like Germany without any electricity would be a bit of a problem, even if it's just for half a day. So they need, they need the backup. And so they looked at the European level and looked at 18 countries with wind energy and looked, can these other countries now help Germany in those days where there is no electricity generated from wind to solve their problem so that the country doesn't come to a stop. And what they found is that basically all over Europe there is almost a correlation in wind production. And so in periods where there is very, very little wind in Germany, you have periods in Europe with very little wind as well. And so the secured capacity is only 4% all over Europe. So you basically cannot have wind from other parts of Europe helping to generate electricity, import electricity into Germany. And they come to the conclusion wind energy therefore requires practically 100% backup. And when they say backup, they mean backup from conventional power generation. So no matter how many wind farms there are in Europe, even if you increase this tenfold, you don't solve the problem of intermittency. So there is this technological problem becoming, and now it's becoming obvious because, 10, 20 years ago you could say, well, in 10, 20 years there will be so many wind turbines, we will solve this problem of intermittency because somewhere in Europe there will be wind. No, there won't be enough. And this is their conclusion. And this is that's the final slide of their presentation, their paper. Wind power production in numerous European countries is correlated. Enforced electricity exchange with neighboring countries can hardly help. Smoothing, which means getting electricity from other countries, only to a minor extent. And wind power practically does not contribute to the security of supply, and wind power practically requires 100% dispatchable systems, meaning conventional power. Now, this is a new paper that was published at the end of last year, but it is based on all wind farms, wind systems in Europe. And it shows you that wind is simply technologically, in the absence of a battery system, storage cannot solve its own problem. So we have that technological problem. Now we're talking about European competitiveness. The EU Commission published a paper in December which shows that energy prices, electricity prices, are now more than double those in the G20, and for industry nearly 50% higher than in the G20, so competing economic areas. So in other words, the policies in the EU, the energy policies and the climate policies have led to a significant rise in energy prices and a significant loss in competitiveness. And of course, you may have heard about this open letter by Britain's richest entrepreneur businessman, Jim Ratcliffe, who owns enormous chemical plants and industries. And he wrote a letter to Jean-Claude Juncker, and just to give you an idea, nobody but nobody in my business seriously invests in Europe. They haven't for a generation. Europe is no longer competitive. It has the worst, the world's most expensive energy and labor laws that are uninviting for employers. Worst of all, it has green taxes that are at best can be described as foolish, as they are having the opposite effect to how they were intended. Now, all of this, and I'm coming now to, give me 5 minutes. 1 minute? 5? So all of this obviously has a political implication, and the political implication is obvious to see. We have revolts, protests in numerous countries, not just in Europe, about the price of the policies. We have, interestingly, governments becoming more concerned about the costs and the political price. I mean, I don't need to tell you what's going on in Holland, but there are big debates with, between the parties about how much they are willing to spend on it. You have in Germany a situation where the policies are beginning to drive the coalition government apart. You have in Ireland a situation where the government doesn't know just how to sell a carbon tax. And in Denmark, the same thing. The green transition has become too expensive. That's the kind of policy sound bites you get nowadays in many capitals. And of course, you have the rise of the populist climate skeptics, the rise of the right-wing populist parties all over Europe. And there was a new report just published recently, and it says one of the main threats to the implementation of the Paris Agreement is the danger that centrist parties, right-wing, center-right parties, will pander to these populist parties. And there is a pretty good chance that these populist parties will do fairly well in the European election. There's a pretty good chance that the right-wing parties, so including the mainstream right-wing parties plus the populists, might have a majority in the European Parliament. And whether that will shift the debate, we'll have to see. But this is my last slide. This is already happening. The European Parliament had agreed that any future trade deals can only be achieved with countries that agree to the Paris Agreement, and a majority of center-right parties now in the European Parliament have overthrown this and have said, we want a deal with the Trump administration, whether they're in Paris or not. So you see already a shift of the center-right conservative parties moving away from the green consensus. So I think we are beginning to see a policy shift, which is very, very slow and very gradual, but could change the debate about the future of European energy policy. So thank you.
Thank you, Benny. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's do only one or two questions, then we take a short break, and then we go on with Nick Lewis. Okay.
It's not really a question, it's a confirmation. In 2 weeks we have an election here in Holland. In 2 weeks we have an election in Holland, and I'm living here in the province of North Holland. And of all the political parties, there is only one that advocates for a different approach to energy. All the other ones want to put wind farms on the North Sea and solar farms on the land. And of course, that one single party is an ultra-right party.
Two parties.
Two parties,
yes.
Yeah.
But I guess it's a populist party. Yeah, okay. That is happening all over Europe. So the populists who were a bit strong on immigration and still on immigration, I think energy and climate policy is another issue where they tend to be against the conventional wisdom. Now, whether you like them or not, these parties, the center-right parties, which are the ones who are mainly in government, will notice that there is populism growing on the right of, their voters. And they will, as the center-right moved towards the Greens 30 years ago, when the Greens rose, they looked to the left and saw the Green parties growing. They greenwashed, they became green. There is a good chance that the center-right parties will be influenced by these populist parties.
I tend to agree. Dolf.
Thank you, Marcel. I have to stand up. Dolf van Wijk. Thank you for raising, for mentioning Jim Ratcliffe as a good example of an investment, a recent investment that he announced in Europe for the chemical industry. He is also very strongly interested in developing shale gas in the UK, investing a lot in it. Can you say something about that? I mean, that is the big development for the moment in the US. Many investments come from shale gas and completely renews the industry there.
Yeah.
And we're lagging behind, and I
Yeah.
know that he is pushing that strong.
Yeah, yeah. There is very little really chance in the short term for shale development, even in Britain, mainly because the government in Britain isn't really wholeheartedly supporting it. They want to look green, and there's a big kind of protest movement against shale. So it will take some time, but there are many big shale deposits in Europe, in France, in Spain, in Britain, huge deposits. That's one of the questions that Europe will have to answer at some point. Will they simply buy just Russian gas and become completely dependent on Russian gas, or will they actually develop their domestic gas fields? We'll have to wait and see. But for the time being, the chances are not very strong. Thank you.